Welcome back to Roman History for Sleep. Tonight, the fire burns low, and our story drifts into its next chapter. Last time, Aeneas and his weary followers set foot upon the long-promised land of Italy, a quiet shore beneath a bronze morning sky. They believed their hardships were finally at an end, but destiny was not finished with them yet. Tonight, we enter the kingdom of Latium, where omens stir the hearts of kings, and gods whisper through the smoke of sacrifice. Aeneas will meet King Latium and his daughter, Lavinia, the woman whose marriage will bind two worlds and awaken jealous eyes that do not sleep. So settle in, let the crackle of the fire steady your thoughts, and let the story carry you gently back through time. This is episode 3, Aeneas and Lavinia, the peace before the storm. Dawn returned to the river like a gentle hand smoothing wrinkled cloth. Mist drifted above the surface, pale and slow, while the water beneath glowed faintly with the colour of new copper. The Trojans' oars slipped into that calm mirror and drew it into ripples that spread, sighed, and closed again. Behind each ripple trailed a piece of their old lives, the smoke of Troy, the salt of wandering, the weight of loss that had become as familiar as breathing. They rowed in silence. Even the usual creak of wood seemed softer, as if the river itself wished to hush them, to cradle them in its ancient peace. Aeneas stood at the prow of the first ship, cloak wrapped tight against the cool air that carried the scent of wet earth and growing things. His eyes followed the twisting course of the Tiber as though it were a sentence the gods had written just for him, and he was still trying to read its meaning, still trying to understand the grammar of destiny. The men were weary. Their faces showed the lines carved by sleepless nights and uncertain horizons. Yet they were lighter than they had been in months. There was land beneath them again, green and generous land that did not threaten to sink or burn. Hope, that fragile guest who had abandoned them so many times before, had returned to the company, though none dared greet it aloud for fear of frightening it away again. The river wound through low meadows, between willows whose branches trailed in the current like the hair of sleeping water nymphs, and tall reeds that whispered to one another in voices that seemed almost comprehensible. Sometimes deer lifted their heads from drinking to watch the passing boats, their liquid eyes curious but unafraid. Once, a heron rose from the shallows with a sound like silk being torn, and glided ahead of them, its long wings brushing the mist with each graceful beat. It felt like an omen, though no one could agree whether of war or peace, and Aeneas decided not to ask. Some questions, he had learned, were better left to time. The current was gentle, almost welcoming, as though the river recognized them as more than strangers. Perhaps it did. Perhaps rivers, having witnessed so much human passage, developed a sense for those who sought homes rather than conquests, for those who carried the seeds of futures rather than the torches of destruction. Arcadians, loyal as ever and just as talkative, finally broke the quiet that had settled over the boats like morning dew. "If this Evander fellow truly welcomes strangers," he said, his voice carrying easily over the soft splash of oars, "perhaps he'll have breakfast waiting. I've been dreaming of fresh bread for 3 days now, warm bread, the kind that steams when you break it." Aeneas smiled faintly, his eyes still on the horizon where the hills began to rise. "If not, we can offer him stories. Those are lighter to carry than bread, and sometimes they nourish just as deeply." "Stories fill the stomach only for poets," Arcadians muttered, though there was affection in his complaint. "And we're tragically short on poets. Most of ours stayed behind in Troy, buried under their own verses." "Give it time," Aeneas said with a knowing smile. "War produces plenty of those. Survivors always need someone to explain why they survived." The men nearby chuckled softly, grateful for any sound that wasn't the splash of oars or the whisper of worried thoughts. Laughter, even small laughter, reminded them they were still human, still capable of lightness despite everything they'd endured. Hours passed with the slow grace of clouds crossing a summer sky. The sun climbed, turning the mist to drifting gold that caught in the willow branches and clung to the water's surface like a blessing. The banks began to rise on either side, forming gentle hills striped with terraces of olive trees, whose silver-green leaves shimmered in the breeze. Smoke curled above them, thin, white, domestic smoke that spoke of hearth fires and morning meals, of normal lives being lived without fear. Somewhere ahead, dogs barked in that particular way that suggested excitement rather than alarm, and the smell of baking bread floated across the water, carried on a breeze that seemed almost deliberately kind. The scent made the men's stomachs clench with longing. Achates shaded his eyes with one weathered hand. "There, a settlement. And no spears pointed at us yet. I'd call that promising. Better than Cyprus at least. And definitely better than that island where everyone tried to eat us. Aeneas followed his gaze. Upon the slope stood a collection of wooden palisades and thatched roofs. A small town hardly larger than a wealthy farmstead, but solid and lived in. Chickens scattered along the bank, their indignant squawks carrying across the water. A pair of children stood knee-deep in the shallows, apparently washing clothes, and they stared wide-eyed at the gleaming ships before dropping everything and running shouting toward the hill, their voices high with excitement. "This must be Latium," Aeneas said, feeling something settle in his chest. Not quite relief, not quite recognition, but something close to both. The place the river promised. "Fate has modest architectural taste," Arcadians replied, studying the simple wooden structures with a critical eye. "I expected something more marble-ish, more eternal-looking." "Every empire begins somewhere," Aeneas said, and there was wisdom in his voice, hard-won through loss and wandering. "Perhaps the gods prefer to start small and surprise us later. Perhaps they want us to remember that all greatness begins in humility, so we don't forget where the foundations lie." The men laughed quietly, the sound thin but genuine, the laughter of people who had learned to find hope in small things, who had discovered that survival itself could be a form of victory. They moored the ships beside a grove of poplars, whose leaves whispered secrets to the wind. The water lapped against the hulls with a sound like breathing, rhythmic and peaceful. Aeneas stepped ashore first, feeling the earth sink slightly under his sandals. The soil was soft, dark, generous, the kind that wanted to grow things, that promised abundance to those patient enough to work with it. He knelt briefly and let the earth run through his fingers, a gesture half prayer, half greeting. A small group of shepherds approached down the slope, wary but not hostile. They carried staves more suited to herding than to war, though the way they held them suggested they could serve either purpose if needed. One of them, an older man with a sun-carved face and eyes that had seen many seasons, called out in a voice that was careful but not unfriendly, "Strangers, what land do you come from, and what brings you to the banks of the sacred Tiber?" Aeneas lifted his hand in the universal gesture of peace, palm open, showing he carried no weapon. "From many lands, friend, and from none. We come from Troy, once the proudest city beneath the stars, now scattered ash on the Aegean wind. We seek your king, Evander of the Arcadians, for the river itself spoke his name in dreams and guided us to his door." The shepherd studied them a long moment, his eyes lingering on their worn armor, the salt stains on their cloaks, the particular weariness that only comes from long wandering. Then he nodded slowly. Decision made. "Follow the path up the hill. He'll see you. King Evander sees everyone, says a king who hides from strangers isn't a king but a hermit with delusions. Mind the goats, though, they're territorial." The path wound through vineyards heavy with young grapes and olive groves where the ancient trees stood like patient grandfathers, their gnarled trunks testimony to decades of careful tending. Children peered from behind these trees, curiosity overcoming shyness. A few bold ones waved with shy smiles. The Trojans looked around in quiet wonder, their expressions softening with each step. They had marched through ruins where walls wept ash. They had sailed across deserts of water where nothing lived but their own desperate hopes. They had seen palaces reduced to ash, temples toppled by vengeful gods, entire cities erased from the earth as though they had never existed. But here life simply continued with the peaceful persistence of grass growing through stone. Goats bleated their complaints about nothing in particular. Women hung laundry between fig trees, their conversation punctuated with laughter. A blacksmith's hammer rang in steady rhythm, shaping something useful from raw metal. Aeneas thought, this is what we fight to make possible. Not glory, not immortality, just mornings like this, where children can play without fear, and bread can rise without being interrupted by screams. They reached the crest and entered the town. It was simple. Houses of timber, weathered grey by sun and rain, streets of packed earth worn smooth by generations of footsteps, small shrines to old gods whose names even the priests of Troy might have forgotten. Yet there was dignity in the place, as if peace itself had built it stone by patient stone, as if every structure had been raised with the deliberate intention of lasting. At the centre stood a hall larger than the rest, roofed with cedar planks darkened by years of smoke. No guards barred the door, no weapons gleamed threateningly in the afternoon sun. Inside, men and women sat at long tables sharing bread and wine, their voices rising and falling in the comfortable rhythm of people who knew each other's stories, who belonged to the same soil. And at the head of the hall, leaning on a carved staff that looked as old as the hills themselves, sat King Evander. He was not the kind of king bards describe in epic songs. No jewels adorned his fingers, no crown pressed circles into his silver hair, no throne of ivory elevated him above his people. His cloak was rough wool, practical against mountain cold. His sandals were dusty from walking his own land. His hands showed calluses from actual work. Yet the moment he spoke, the room stilled as though commanded by something deeper than authority, by respect earned through decades of fair judgment. "Strangers," he said, his voice carrying the kind of warmth that comes from genuine curiosity, rather than political courtesy. "Welcome to a city that is still learning to call itself a city. We're more of an ambitious village, truth be told. Who leads you?" A tyrant stepped forward, and as he did, he felt the weight of every decision that had brought him to this moment. The flight from burning Troy, the lost wanderings across hostile seas, the loves abandoned, and the promises made to gods and men. "I am a Tyrant of Troy," he said simply, for what else was there to say? "My people have wandered far, seeking a place to rest. The river Tiber guided us here with dreams and whispers. We come not as conquerors but as seekers." Evander studied him with eyes that seemed to see beyond armor, and titles to whatever truth lived underneath. When he finally spoke, it was with approval. "The river guided you, did it? It guides wisely then. The Tiber knows its own business better than we know ours." He gestured to the tables with his staff. "Sit, Trojan. You and your men will eat before you tell your tale. Hunger makes bad storytellers. Everything becomes about the next meal rather than the last battle." They ate, and it was glorious in its simplicity. Bread still warm from the hearth, its crust crackling under their fingers, releasing steam that smelled of yeast and grain and home. Cheese scented with herbs from the mountain slopes, its texture perfect between crumbly and smooth. Wine watered but sweet, the kind that loosens tongues without stealing sense. The hall filled with the hum of easy conversation, laughter that came naturally rather than forced. It had been so long since the Trojans had eaten without caution, without one hand near a weapon, that they almost forgot how to do it. "Careful," a Chartace murmured to the man beside him. A joke in his voice, but also a genuine warning. "If we get used to this, we'll forget how to scowl properly in armor. We'll smile at our enemies and they'll think we've gone soft." Aeneas leaned toward him, keeping his voice low. "Then we'll relearn scowling tomorrow. Tonight, let's remember what peace tastes like, so we know what we're fighting for." They shared a quiet grin, the kind that lives somewhere between gratitude and disbelief, between sorrow for what was lost and hope for what might yet be found. Across the table sat Evander's son Pallas, and Aeneas felt his heart contract at the sight. The boy, no, the young man, for he was past the threshold of childhood, wore his armor as though it were costume jewelry, polished but unnecessary, beautiful but never tested. His face glowed with the particular energy of youth that has not yet been taxed by history, that still believes in clear victories and honorable defeats. He listened to every word Aeneas spoke, eyes bright as new coins, as if the Trojan scars were medals rather than memories, as if suffering bestowed some kind of romantic nobility rather than just pain. Evander noticed his son's attention and sighed, a sound heavy with fatherly love and the particular worry of those who have survived long enough to understand what awaits the brave. "The boy looks at you the way a pup looks at thunder," he said quietly, so only Aeneas could hear. Half awe, half the desire to chase it and prove he's not afraid. Aeneas smiled gently, sadly, seeing in Pallas every young soldier he'd ever known, every eager face that had marched toward glory, only to find mud and screaming, and the particular loneliness of dying far from home. "Thunder usually wins that contest," he said. "Yes," Evander agreed, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But it's a glorious lesson while it lasts. And sometimes, just sometimes, the pup survives and becomes something magnificent. We can hope." After the first hunger passed, after plates had been emptied and refilled and emptied again, the talk turned to stories, as it always does among people who have lived long enough to understand that tales are another kind of bread. That narrative nourishes something in the soul that food alone cannot reach. Evander spoke of his own journey, how his ancestors had left Arcadia generations ago, following omens and dreams across the wine-dark sea until the Tiber welcomed them with open banks. He described the first winters here, when the wolves outnumbered the people and seemed intent on keeping it that way, when the stars were their only reliable map and hope was rationed more carefully than grain. "Many nights," he said, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting holy text, "I thought we'd made a terrible mistake. I thought the gods had misheard our prayers, had sent us to the wrong river, the wrong valley. The cold was brutal, the land resisted our plows. Every day was a negotiation with disaster." He paused, sipping his wine, But the land spoke kindly, eventually. It gives if you ask politely and prune the vines when they tell you to, if you listen more than you demand. Aeneas listened, hearing in the old king's words an echo of his own wanderings, his own negotiations with fate and soil and the gods who seemed to delight in testing mortal patience. He thought of nights on unknown shores, of the faces he had buried in foreign earth, of the promises he still carried like stones in his pockets. "Your people are fortunate," he said softly, and meant it. "You found a home that stayed found." Evander nodded slowly, considering the weight of that statement. Perhaps because we never stopped thanking it. Cities fall when they forget to say thank you to land, to gods, to one another. Pride is just ingratitude wearing armor and calling itself strength. Aeneas turned that over in his mind like a coin, admiring its weight, testing its ring against the anvil of his experience. It felt true in a way that prophecies rarely did. A group of musicians entered then, breaking the contemplative mood with welcome distraction. 3 men with lyres whose strings had been tuned to match each other's voices, and a girl who sang in a voice thin but sweet, the kind that can fill a room without ever raising itself above conversation level. They sang of Hercules, who had once walked these same hills when the world was younger and monsters more common, and of the monster Cacus, who breathed smoke and fear from his cave until the hero broke his back against the very stones that still marked the valley below. Evander clapped in time, genuinely pleased with the telling, his face lit with the particular joy of hearing a familiar story told well. "Every feast needs a monster slain," he declared when the song ended. "Keeps appetites heroic, and reminds us that evil, no matter how smoky its breath, can be defeated by sufficiently determined goodness." Aeneas chuckled, the sound warm. "I prefer mine symbolic these days. Actual monsters require too much cleanup." "Symbolic monsters are the most dangerous kind," Evander said, suddenly serious despite the levity of the moment. "You can never quite tell when they're dead. They resurrect in different forms, wearing different faces. At least with Cacus we could point to his corpse." The Trojans laughed softly, understanding. Even Pallas grinned, though the deeper meaning likely escaped him. He had not yet learned that the worst monsters often wore familiar faces and spoke in reasonable voices. The feast went on as the sun descended outside, marking time with lengthening shadows. Wine flowed easily, though never enough to dull the mind in this place. Drunkenness felt like bad manners toward the gods, a failure of respect. Aeneas found himself talking freely, more freely than he had in months, perhaps years. The words spilled out like water from a cracked jar. Of Troy's last night when the world ended in fire and screaming. Of the sea's cruelty and its occasional unexpected mercy. Of Carthage and its queen whose name he spoke only once, and quietly, as though saying it too loudly might summon her ghost or worse, his own guilt. Evander listened without interruption, without judgment, his face showing only the deep attention of someone who understood that sometimes the greatest gift is simply bearing witness to another's pain. When Aeneas finally finished, when his voice trailed off into the crackling of the fire, the old king said nothing for a long while. At last he sighed, and it was the sigh of someone who had carried his own share of regrets across too many years. "We're all haunted by the geography of our mistakes," he said quietly. "Some build altars to them, turning error into religion. Others build roads away from them, trying to outrun memory. You seem to prefer the latter." Aeneas smiled faintly, recognizing the truth in the observation. "I've had practice, enough practice to become skilled at departure, if not at arrival. And you'll need more practice still," Evander said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Turnus grows restless to the south. The young mistake pride for purpose, ambition for destiny. He sees your arrival as theft of land, of bride, of some imagined glory he believes the gods promised him personally." "I know the kind," Aeneas murmured, thinking of Paris, of Hector's warnings ignored, of how many Troys had burned because young men confused desire with divine right. They hear destiny calling, and assume it's their own name being spoken rather than a general summons to suffering. Evander nodded gravely. "I can offer you what help I can, men, food, guidance up the river to where other allies might be found, but you must promise something in return." He paused, his eyes holding Aeneas with unexpected intensity. "Promise that when your city rises on those hills the river showed you it remembers kindness before conquest. Promise that power becomes the servant of justice rather than its master." The words landed like a blessing and a warning in one, like a gift wrapped in responsibility. Aeneas felt their weight settle across his shoulders alongside all the other promises he carried. He bowed his head, the gesture one of genuine acceptance rather than mere courtesy. "I promise," he said, and meant it with everything in him that was still capable of meaning. "I swear by the gods who have tormented and guided me equally, that if this city rises, it will be built on something better than the ruins of other people's dreams." Evander smiled, satisfied, and the tension in the room eased like a bow being unstrung. "Good," he said softly. "Good. Now drink. Promises sound more convincing over wine, and witnesses remember them better when they're slightly tipsy." Laughter rippled through the hall, breaking the solemnity of the moment, reminding everyone that they were not just making history, but living lives. Later, when the plates were cleared and the fire burned low, turning from yellow flame to red ember to glowing coal, Evander's people gathered around to listen as Aeneas told his own stories. He spoke of Priam's courage in the face of certain death, of Hector's ghost appearing with warnings in the smoke-filled corridors of dying Troy, of the storm that had nearly drowned them all while the gods argued overhead about whether they deserved saving. But he told it gently, softening the sharp edges of horror, speaking of tragedy as though soothing rather than stirring the heart. He had learnt this art during the long voyage, how to make disaster into something bearable through distance and tone, how to transform trauma into story so it could be carried forward without crushing those who carried it. Even the children stayed awake, eyes wide, sensing that they were hearing the prologue to something vast, that these words would be repeated for generations, would be studied and debated and turned into songs. When he finished, silence lingered in the hall. Thick, reverent, the kind of silence that follows truly important speech. Then Evander rose slowly, using his staff for support, and said with the weight of benediction, "You've carried sorrow long enough, son of Anchises. Let joy rest on your shoulders tonight, even if only for a few hours. Tomorrow we'll speak of alliances and strategy, of who marches where and for what purpose. Tonight we eat, we remember, and we thank the gods that our stories crossed paths before either of us reached the end of our wandering." The night deepened outside the hall. The wind brushed through the olive trees with the soft cadence of a lullaby sung by the earth itself. Within the hall, men drowsed by the hearth, their bodies finally releasing the tension that had held them upright for so many months of uncertainty. The last logs broke into glowing embers that pulsed like the heartbeats of sleeping dragons. Aeneas sat awake a little longer, unable quite to surrender to rest, staring into the flames as though they might reveal some answer he hadn't yet thought to ask. Each spark that drifted upward reminded him of Troy's burning. How strange that fire could be both destroyer and comforter, both the end of everything and the promise of warmth through cold nights. But now the fire seemed gentler, more forgiving, as if the past itself could learn mercy given enough time. Pallas approached quietly and sat beside him without asking permission, and Aeneas appreciated the informal courage of it. For a while neither spoke, simply sharing the fire's warmth and the companionable silence of people who understand that not all communication requires words. Then the boy, and he was still a boy despite his armor and his height, said softly, "You really saw Troy fall? You were there when the greatest city in the world burned?" Aeneas nodded, the memory moving behind his eyes like shadows. "I saw everything I loved turn to ash, and I carried what ash I could in my hands and heart. I saved my father and my son, and lost almost everything else. Were you afraid?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity, rather than challenge. "Yes," Aeneas said simply, finding unexpected relief in honesty. "Terrified, every moment. But fear is only dangerous when it forgets to move forward, when it roots itself and becomes paralysis. Fear that keeps walking becomes something else, becomes determination maybe, or endurance." Pallas considered this carefully, turning it over the way a jeweler might examine a stone for flaws. "Then maybe I'll try to be brave and moving, rather than brave and standing still." Aeneas smiled, seeing in this young face every reason he'd fought to survive, every promise he'd made to the future. That's all any of us can manage. That's the secret they don't tell you in the hero songs. It's not about being fearless, it's about being afraid but moving anyway. The boy lingered a moment longer, his eyes drawn to Aeneas's shield leaning against the wall. His old shield, battered and scarred from countless battles, soon to be replaced by divine craftsmanship, though neither of them knew it yet. Then Pallas slipped away to sleep, leaving Aeneas alone with the dying fire and the weight of too many thoughts. He remained there as others found their rest, Evander's words circling in his mind like birds that couldn't quite land. Remember kindness before conquest. Outside, the river murmured its agreement, or perhaps its warning with rivers. It was hard to tell the difference. He thought of the hills Evander had pointed toward earlier, before the feast began. The 7 sleeping mounds that would one day wear crowns of marble and echo with the footsteps of empire. He wondered what sort of city could live up to all this hope, all these promises made to kings and gods and his own desperate heart. A peaceful one, he prayed, a just one, though he suspected with the particular cynicism that comes from surviving too much, that peace was always the first casualty of greatness. He lay back at last, pulling his cloak tighter against the night's chill, the fur ruff beneath his head. Above him, gaps in the roof beams revealed handfuls of stars, ancient and indifferent. They looked like tiny openings into eternity, like someone had poked holes in the fabric of darkness to let the light of heaven leak through. Somewhere among those stars, he imagined Venus watching, perhaps proud, perhaps simply worried in the way mothers always worry, unable to stop even when their children are grown and chosen by destiny. Sleep came slowly, like a tide returning to shore after long absence. In his dreams he stood again by the river, but this time it ran not with water but with pure light, liquid gold that flowed without sound, without beginning or end. He saw reflections in that luminous current of things that had not yet happened, images that shouldn't exist but did, crowded streets filled with voices speaking Latin, with accents from every corner of the world, marble arches so high they seemed to prop up the sky itself, aqueducts carrying water across impossible distances, libraries where the collected wisdom of humanity rested in careful rows. The city felt alive beneath the centuries, breathing with the accumulated breath of millions yet unborn. And somewhere in the dream a child's laughter echoed, the laughter of a world not yet made, of possibility itself finding voice. He reached out to touch the light, and it folded around him like welcoming arms. It was warm, almost merciful, carrying no judgment, only promise. Then the vision faded into darkness and the simple hush of night, leaving behind only the memory of hope and the faint smell of roses that had no earthly source. And thus ended Aeneas's first night as a guest of Evander. An evening of shared bread, quiet laughter, and words that would one day shape empires, though none present fully understood their weight. No banners flew outside the humble hall, no trumpets called across the valley. Yet in that place of rough wood and simple kindness, the first alliance of destiny was forged, not in blood but in friendship and the particular hope that rises when good people recognize each other across the chaos of fate. Morning rose slowly over Palanteum, as though reluctant to disturb the peace that had settled over the sleeping settlement. The mist that had slept among the olive trees began to drift upward, revealing terraces of dew-drenched grass that sparkled like scattered diamonds in the early light. Aeneas awoke to the smell of wood smoke and barley bread, to the quiet sounds of a town stretching its limbs after rest, yawning itself into another day of simple survival and patient growth. Somewhere below, goats complained softly about the indignity of mourning, and a woman's voice sang as she drew water from the well. An old song in a language that predated cities, that spoke of rivers and seasons, and the eternal cycle of planting and harvest. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that feels temporary only because one has lived too long without it, that seems fragile simply because it's unfamiliar. Aeneas lay still a moment longer than necessary, letting the small sounds of life settle around him like the layers of a warm cloak. He heard children arguing over some game outside, heard the clang of the blacksmith's hammer already beginning its daily rhythm, heard the bleating of sheep being led to pasture and the soft murmur of voices greeting each other in the street. When he finally rose, the first light had turned the distant river to molten silver, a ribbon of possibility winding through the green valley. Evander was waiting outside, leaning on his staff, watching the sunrise as if it were an old friend returning from a long and dangerous journey. His face was peaceful, lined with age but not bitterness. "You sleep lightly," he observed without turning his head. Aeneas smiled, joining him in contemplation of the dawn. Old habits. The sea teaches a man to wake before trouble does, to keep one eye always watching the horizon. "Then you'll fit well here," Evander replied with a chuckle. "Trouble keeps the same schedule everywhere. It's the one truly reliable thing about life. Trouble and sunrise, the twin certainties." They walked together through the waking settlement, their footsteps leaving dark tracks in the dew-wet grass. The king greeted every passerby by name. Each greeting came with a small laugh or a question about crops or children, about elderly parents or troublesome goats. It was a kind of leadership Aeneas had rarely seen, quiet, woven through daily life instead of sitting above it in distant authority. Evander didn't rule his people so much as live among them, sharing their concerns as though they were his own, which perhaps they were. They passed a blacksmith's hut where sparks leapt like orange insects from the anvil's face, each one trailing light before winking into darkness. A child worked the bellows, serious as a priest performing ritual, understanding that his task mattered even if he didn't fully comprehend why. Further along, potters were already turning clay, their wheels humming in the morning light, hands shaping formless earth into vessels that would carry water, store grain, hold the stuff of life itself. Nothing about the place spoke of greatness in any traditional sense. There were no grand temples, no palaces, no monuments to conquest or displays of wealth. Yet everything about it whispered endurance, spoke of roots going deep, promised continuity across generations. Evander gestured with his staff toward the eastern hills, where the sun was now fully risen, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Come. There's something I want you to see before the day grows loud and complicated with human concerns. They followed a narrow path that climbed between rocks speckled with moss and lichen, between outcroppings where small flowers grew in impossible crevices, proving that life finds a way even in the harshest conditions. The air smelled of thyme and damp earth, of mountain springs and the distant sea. Birds darted from branch to branch ahead of them, as if escorting the strangers upward, leading them toward some revelation. At the crest, the land opened wide into a vista that stole breath and words equally. The Tiber wound below like a polished serpent of impossible beauty, catching the light and throwing it back transformed. Beyond it the valley stretched, soft, immense, and filled with the promise of harvest, with the potential of centuries not yet born. Mists still clung to the lower ground, glowing pale gold in the sun. And through them Aeneas could almost see shapes forming, walls that didn't exist, towers that waited in possibility, streets that would one day carry the footsteps of millions. This, Evander said softly, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy, is the heart of Latium. It beats slow, but it beats long. Empires rush and burn. This valley simply continues. Aeneas stood beside him, silent, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what he was seeing, not just the physical landscape but the potential it held, the future it promised. He felt the way sailors feel when the wind suddenly shifts toward home after months of contrary gales. No simple joy, only the sharp, aching certainty of direction, the sense that everything has been leading to precisely this moment. The earth itself seemed to breathe beneath his feet, as though waiting to be named, waiting for someone to speak the word that would transform it from mere geography into destiny. Evander pointed toward a cluster of gentle mounds rising from the plain like the knuckles of some buried giant's hand. 7 distinct hills, each with its own character, one steep and defensive, another broad and welcoming, a third standing slightly apart as though keeping watch. There, 7 hills. When my people came to this valley, we built altars on each to honor the gods whose names we knew and the ones we'd forgotten. I've always believed the gods left them for someone greater than me, arranged them just so for a purpose not yet revealed. He turned to Aeneas, his eyes narrowing against the sun but losing none of their intensity. Perhaps they were waiting for you. Perhaps they've been waiting for your people since the world was young. Aeneas gave a small laugh, uncomfortable with the weight of such expectations. The gods have strange patience. They could have sent clearer instructions, a map perhaps, a list of requirements, something more specific than dreams and vague promises. They seldom do, Evander said, and there was amusement in his voice.
Clarity spoils the mystery, and without mystery, priests go hungry, and philosophers have nothing to argue about.
Aeneas smiled, but his gaze remained fixed on the hills. He tried to imagine walls there, towers of marble instead of olive groves, markets where goats now wandered freely, legions marching in perfect formation where shepherds currently tended their scattered flocks. The image felt impossible, absurd even, yet the impossibility thrilled him in a way he couldn't quite name. Evander began to speak again, his voice taking on the quality of half chant, half memory, the tone of someone reciting stories told by grandparents who heard them from their own grandparents. Long before us, before Troy even existed, before the great flood reshaped the world, Saturn came to these lands. The gods had cast him down from his golden throne in heaven, overthrown by his own children as he had overthrown his father before him, the eternal cycle. He wandered the earth as an exile, much as you wander now, until he found these hills. He paused, letting the parallel sink in. Here he taught men to plough the earth, to measure time by the movements of stars, to live by laws instead of fear and strength. They called it the Saturnian reign, an age when no man owned the earth because all men belonged to it, when grain grew without labor and the seasons were gentle, a golden age. He drew a line in the dust with his staff, bisecting the world into before and after. But golden ages always tarnish, don't they? New kings rise with new ideas, and they forget the old songs. They think progress means abandoning what came before, but someday perhaps the world may learn those songs again. Perhaps through you, perhaps through the city your descendants build on those 7 hills. Aeneas listened, feeling the words settle deep into some part of him that had been waiting to hear them. My people were promised a land where order and peace would take root again, he said slowly. I thought it was only about survival, finding a place where we wouldn't be killed, where we could rebuild something small and safe. Perhaps it's more than that. Survival is always more than it looks, Evander said wisely. The seed thinks it's just escaping a bird's stomach, not founding a forest that will stand 1,000 years. He chuckled to himself, the sound warm and self-aware. Of course my metaphors run away from me like goats who've spotted an open gate. Comes with age, I'm afraid. My advisors say I speak in riddles because I enjoy hearing myself explained. Aeneas laughed quietly, genuinely amused. I find riddles easier to trust than prophecies. At least riddles admit they're confusing. Prophecies pretend to clarity while being deliberately obscure. Evander tapped his staff against a rock, the sound sharp in the morning air. Then let's confuse you further. Look again at those hills. What do you see? Fields? Goats? A few stubborn trees refusing to grow where they're planted. Good. Now look harder. Look with more than your eyes. Aeneas narrowed his focus, letting his vision blur slightly, trying to see beyond the obvious. Lines, he said after a moment. I see lines in the landscape. The shape of walls, maybe. Roads connecting them. Patterns in how the hills relate to each other. The king nodded slowly, satisfied. Sometimes the future hides in plain geometry. The gods write their intentions in the shape of land itself, for those patient enough to read. They stood in silence. The wind moved through the grass, creating waves that shimmered in patterns almost too perfect to be accidental, as though the earth itself were breathing in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat. For a single heartbeat, Aeneas could swear he heard distant echoes, hammer blows falling in rhythm, footsteps of marching thousands, a murmur of languages yet unborn, the roar of crowds in some vast arena that existed only in possibility. Then the vision faded as quickly as it had come, leaving only the wind and the morning and the eternal patience of stone. Evander looked at him carefully, studying his face. Did you feel it? Did you touch the future for a moment? Yes, Aeneas said, his voice barely above a whisper. Like standing in the memory of something that hasn't happened yet. Like being haunted by ghosts who haven't been born. The old man smiled, and there was something almost victorious in the expression. That's what destiny feels like when you're standing at its beginning. It remembers before it exists. Time isn't as linear as we like to think. The future reaches backward to touch those who will create it. They descended slowly, following the path back toward the river, neither feeling the need to rush. The valley below was waking fully now, farmers calling to their oxen in voices worn smooth by decades of the same calls, children chasing one another through fields of young wheat, their laughter rising like birdsong. It was such an ordinary sight that it felt sacred, proof that life continues regardless of prophecy or destiny. Tell me, Evander said as they walked, when your city stands on those hills, and it will stand, make no mistake, what kind of place will it be? What laws will govern it? Aeneas hesitated, feeling the weight of the question. A place where laws serve mercy rather than power, where strength protects the weak instead of exploiting them, where power is the servant of justice, not its master. The king nodded approvingly, though his expression suggested he'd heard such ideals before, and watched them erode under the pressure of reality. A fine blueprint. May the masons of the future prove as wise as the architect. May they remember your intentions when success makes them arrogant. They reached a small shrine halfway down the slope. It was simple. A ring of stones worn smooth by weather and countless hands, a few offerings of fruit already attracting bees, a clay figure so old its features had been worn into abstraction. Evander bowed briefly, with genuine reverence rather than empty ceremony. This is the altar of Hercules, he said. He saved us once from the monster Cacus who lived in the cave below, who breathed fire and stole our cattle in the night. When we feast tonight, we'll honor him with wine and song. The gods love anniversaries, especially the ones they didn't plan. Aeneas touched the altar lightly, feeling the cool surface beneath his palm, still damp with morning dew. I wonder what Hercules would think if he saw what his victory became. A shrine, a story, a reason for feasting. He'd ask for wine first? Evander said with certainty. Heroes always do. Philosophy comes after the first cup. They continued down, the path turning through vineyards heavy with unripe fruit that would sweeten in the late summer sun. Bees swarmed lazily among the blossoms, drunk on nectar and warmth. The scent of crushed thyme clung to their sandals with each step, and Aeneas breathed it in deeply, committing the smell to memory with deliberate intention. If this truly would be the foundation of something eternal, he wanted to remember it as it was now, before marble replaced wood, before empire replaced simplicity, when everything still smelled of earth and hope and possibility. At the foot of the hill, the river waited with the patience of something that knows it will outlast empires. Its surface caught the afternoon light and held it like a mirror, reflecting sky and cloud and the wheeling flight of birds. Evander leaned heavily on his staff, suddenly looking every year of his age. When you leave here, follow the current upstream. There are friends to be found in the mountains, and enemies pretending to be friends in the valleys. The river will guide you better than men's maps, better than any ambassador's promises. Aeneas looked at him, curious. You speak of it as though it were alive, as though it has intention. It is, Evander said simply, as though stating an obvious fact. Everything that endures long enough learns how to live. Rivers, mountains, cities, they develop something like consciousness through sheer persistence. They paused by the water's edge. A small group of Evander's people were washing tools there, scrubbing away yesterday's earth to prepare for today's labour, their laughter carrying across the surface in bright fragments. Aeneas watched them and felt an ache, not of loss this time, but of longing for what might yet be. Perhaps that was the difference between despair and destiny. One looks backward at what's gone, the other forward at what might come, but both hurt the same way, occupy the same place in the chest. The wind shifted suddenly, and for a moment the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat that had no source. Aeneas thought he saw outlines forming in the light, arches spanning impossible distances, columns holding up the sky itself, banners snapping in winds that hadn't yet blown, shapes that vanished the instant he tried to focus on them directly, that existed only in peripheral vision. He exhaled slowly, steadying himself against the weight of vision. The gods are generous with hints, he murmured, but stingy with instructions. They show me enough to drive me forward, but not enough to give me peace. Evander smiled, understanding perfectly. That's how they keep us busy. That's how they ensure we never stop moving, never stop building. If they told us everything, we'd either despair at the impossibility, or grow lazy with certainty. The two men stood there a long while, saying little, letting the silence speak for them. The river whispered its secrets in a language older than words. The hills listened with the patience of stone, and the future, just out of sight beyond the veil of present moment, adjusted its crown and waited to be born. When at last they turned back toward the settlement, the sun was lowering again toward the western hills. The shadow of those hills stretched long across the valley like a giant's hand reaching toward the place where Rome would one day stand, its fingers of darkness touching the 7 mounds with something like blessing. Aeneas walked in that shadow and felt no fear. He felt purpose. The rarest kind, the quiet kind that doesn't need trumpets to prove it is there, that doesn't require witnesses or proclamations. It simply exists, solid as stone, patient as rivers. Evander glanced at him and nodded, as if seeing the change that had occurred during their morning walk. Good, he said softly. You're starting to look like a founder instead of a refugee. Your shoulders sit differently now. Aeneas smiled, weary but sure in a way he hadn't been since Troy fell. Let's hope the gods agree with your assessment. They will, Evander said with confidence. Eventually. The gods are slow readers, but they get there in the end. They reached the hall just as the torches were being lit for evening. Children ran past carrying baskets of fresh figs, their fingers already stained purple with juice. Somewhere a flute began to play, a simple melody, almost childlike in its purity. The smell of roasting meat drifted through the gathering dusk. Life, patient and repeating, wrapped itself once more around the two men who had spent the day talking about forever while walking through the present moment. Evander rested a hand on Aeneas's shoulder, the gesture both blessing and farewell to the morning they'd shared. Tomorrow you'll meet our craftsmen and soldiers. They're fewer than you'd wish, less experienced than you'd hope, but braver than you'd expect. Tonight, eat and rest. You'll need strength for the path fate opens next. I will, Aeneas said, meaning it. But I'll remember this hill, I'll remember this morning when you showed me what I couldn't see alone. Do. Evander said seriously. Someday the world will remember it too. Someday people will stand where we stood and wonder what we saw, what we knew, make sure the story they tell is true. Night settled over Latium like a gentle hand closing over a candle flame. not extinguishing it, just containing its light. The river gleamed faintly in the starlight, winding through fields that would one day be swallowed by marble and bronze, by the weight of empire and the endless footsteps of history. In the darkness, fireflies floated like tiny lanterns, mapping invisible constellations of what was to come. Their light pulsed in rhythm with something deeper than biology, the heartbeat of the future perhaps, announcing itself in the smallest possible way. And up on the quiet hill where Aeneas and Evander had stood that morning, two sets of footprints marked the dust, an old man's steady and measured, a younger man's resolute and sure. Between those tracks lay a city still dreaming of itself, still gathering the courage to exist. Thus ended the day when Aeneas first saw the hills of his descendants, the day when a wandering exile stood where eternity would someday take root. No trumpets announced the moment, no prophecy was carved in stone for future generations to puzzle over. There was only the murmur of the river and an old king's voice saying, "Look harder," and the quiet certainty that the world, though it did not yet know it, had begun to change in ways that would echo through millennia. Night had descended upon Italy with the weight of velvet, heavy and complete. The darkness was so total it seemed to belong to another age, to the time before humans learned to push back the shadows with fire. The campfires of Aeneas's men glowed faintly along the riverbank, small stars fallen to earth, claiming tiny territories against the vast night. The soldiers slept curled in their cloaks like children, dreaming of families left behind in ash and futures not yet born. Even the river moved more softly now, its eternal murmur turning into the gentle rhythm of a lullaby sung by the earth itself. But in the heavens above, there was no sleep. The gods, as ever, found rest an optional virtue, a weakness of mortality they had long since transcended. Venus stood at the edge of a cloud palace, her form luminous against the darkness, and looked down upon the dark valley of Latium far below. Her eyes, bright as morning starfire, traced the curve of the Tiber until she found her son's camp. She could see him even through the mist and distance. Aeneas, seated beside a dwindling fire, his head bowed under the weight of thought, the firelight flickering across the lines of care that destiny had etched into his face like a sculptor working reluctant stone. Of all the mortal sons of the gods, and there were many, scattered across the world like seeds from a careless hand, none had ever carried such weight with such grace. She loved him for that, and feared for it equally. The gods, after all, admire endurance in mortals the way spectators admire dancers balancing on narrow ropes. It's beautiful and inspiring right up until the moment it ends in disaster. She whispered to herself, her voice carrying no farther than her own ears. "You have given him the world to carry, Jupiter. Must you also take his peace? Was Troy not enough sacrifice?" No answer came from the thunder god, only the slow drift of cloud shadow across the moon's pale face. Jupiter kept his own counsel, as always, playing games too complex for even other gods to fully understand. Venus sighed, the sound like wind through autumn leaves. "Very well, if fate demands his struggle, let me at least arm him for it. If I cannot change his path, I can at least ensure he walks it properly equipped." She turned her gaze eastward, toward the distant mountain that burned red, even at midnight, a wound in the darkness that never healed. The forge of Vulcan, her husband in name if not always in affection, her sometime companion in the complex politics of divine marriage, her occasional rival in the endless games of Olympus, and above all the god whose hammers built the bones of heaven and shaped the weapons that decided the fates of worlds. The mountain's peak split the clouds like an ember held in the heart of infinite night. Sparks leapt from its sides in irregular bursts, flaring briefly against the darkness before falling into nothing, like stars choosing to die young rather than fade slowly. Deep inside that mountain, Vulcan's forge roared with a thunder made of rhythm, a heartbeat of creation that never rested, never slowed. Venus descended through the smoke, her divine nature protecting her from heat that would reduce mortal flesh to ash in an instant. The air grew warmer with each moment, thick and tasting of iron and sulfur, of Earth's deepest secrets brought forcibly to the surface. Molten rivers ran through channels carved by time itself, their glow painting the rough rock walls in living gold that shifted and danced with each movement of the liquid stone. The Cyclopes were already at work, massive figures with arms like tree trunks and single eyes that gleamed with the reflection of molten metal. They sang while they laboured deep, wordless songs that kept the rhythm of their hammers steady, that turned labour into something almost holy. Each voice harmonised with the others in chords that predated music, that spoke to something fundamental about the nature of creation itself. At the centre of this organised chaos stood Vulcan himself, broad-shouldered and powerful, half shadowed by the firelight, half illuminated by the glow of his own work. His hammer rose and fell in measured grace, each strike sending sparks scattering like small meteors, each blow shaping reality into new forms. Venus paused to watch him work. She had always admired the way he approached his craft, not with the violence the hammering might suggest, but with precision and something like tenderness. Creation, she thought, was simply another form of love, expressed through heat and patience, and the careful application of force. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but carrying easily over the din. "My lord of the anvil, master of the forge." Vulcan stopped mid-swing, his hammer frozen at the apex of its arc. He turned slowly, a smile spreading across his soot-stained face.
"Ah, the last time you called me my lord, I believe you were about to ask for something expensive, something that would require me to work through several nights without rest."
"Then I am consistent," she said, and there was the hint of a smile in her voice. "Consistency is a virtue, or so I've been told." He laughed quietly, setting the hammer aside with care. "I wondered when you would come. The heavens have been restless these past weeks. Your son's name passes even among the thunderbolts these days, spoken in whispers when Jupiter isn't listening." "Fate has a talent for gossip," Venus replied, stepping closer into the forge's heat. "He stands now in Italy, at the edge of another war. Juno will not rest until he's ruined, until every drop of Trojan blood is returned to the earth." "Juno seldom rests at all," Vulcan said dryly, his voice carrying the weariness of someone who dealt with the Queen of Heaven for too many centuries. "The woman collects grudges like other gods collect offerings. She maintains them carefully, polishes them regularly, never lets them fade." Venus smiled faintly, despite the gravity of her purpose. "Then let us offer her something she cannot break. Something that will protect him from even her endless malice." She stepped closer still, until the light from the molten pools reflected across her face, making her seem made of flame herself. "Forge for him a shield, one that carries the promise of what is to come. Not just protection from spears and arrows, but something more, a reminder of why he suffers." Vulcan's expression softened in a way that few ever saw. He had once loved her fiercely, completely. In truth, a part of him always would, despite everything. "You ask me to make destiny visible, to forge the future itself." "Yes," she said simply. "He bears the burden of a future he cannot see, fighting for people not yet born. Let him carry its image, so that in the darkest moments he remembers what he suffers for. Let him look down at his shield and see hope made tangible." For a long moment the forge was silent except for the hiss of molten metal and the steady breathing of the Cyclopes. Vulcan studied her face, seeing the worry there, the love that even goddess mothers cannot escape. Then he nodded slowly. "Very well, for you and for him, for the son who never asked for divine favor but received it anyway." He raised his voice, calling out to his assistants in a tone that made the mountain tremble. "Brontos, Steropes, Pyrrhacmon, set aside Jupiter's lightning for now. Tonight we work for Venus, tonight we forge for the future." The Cyclopes straightened from their anvils, their single eyes widening in surprise but also eagerness. They obeyed without question, without hesitation. Everyone loved a project blessed by beauty, and Venus was beauty itself made divine. The forge burst into life with renewed intensity. Bellows roared like beasts challenging the sky. The molten streams quickened, flowing faster, glowing white-hot instead of merely red. Hammers struck anvils in perfect rhythm, and every blow shook the mountain to its roots, sent tremors through the earth that mortals below would mistake for the stirring of sleeping giants. They began with bronze, the metal of heroes, folding it with gold until it gleamed like the first light of dawn. From this mixture they forged a breastplate that seemed to glow with its own inner light, that would shine even in shadow. They crafted greaves so light they seemed woven from sunlight itself, that would protect without weighing down. They shaped a helmet crowned with crimson plumes that would never burn, never fade, marking its wearer as someone chosen by fate. But Vulcan himself took up the greatest challenge. He selected a circular sheet of metal, as wide as a man's height, perfect in its symmetry. "The shield," he murmured, his voice reverent. He set it upon his personal anvil, the one he used only for masterworks. "This will be remembered longer than mountains." With deliberate, careful strokes he began to shape not only its form but its story, hammering meaning into metal, forcing possibility into solid reality. Upon its face he carved visions, the future as only gods can see it, compressed into a single endless moment of perfect clarity. He carved twin infants, abandoned but not alone, suckling at the teats of a she-wolf beneath the shelter of a sacred fig tree. Their faces showed both hunger and contentment, vulnerability, and the strange safety found in unexpected places. The she-wolf's expression mixed ferocity with something like tenderness, the look of a mother protecting cubs not her own. He carved 7 hills, crowned with temples whose architecture surpassed anything currently existing in the mortal world, and roads stretching outward from them like veins of marble, connecting distant lands, making the impossible journey routine. He carved battles that would one day shake the earth. Carthage burning on its African coast, the flames so real they seemed to leap from the bronze itself. He depicted legions crossing seas in ships that hadn't been designed yet, carrying standards that bore an eagle whose wings would shadow half the world. He showed 1,000 banners rising beneath those wings, speaking languages yet unborn, united by force and law into something no one had yet imagined. He carved a man in white robes, his face stern with the weight of justice, holding the world's laws in his open hands, laws that would be copied and studied for thousands of years. He carved another steering ships toward distant continents, planting the seeds of empire in soil that had never known Mediterranean wheat. He showed triumphs, victorious generals parading through streets while crowds cheered and prisoners walked in chains. He showed tragedies, brothers fighting brothers, republics collapsing into tyranny, tyrannies being overthrown by furious mobs. Each image glowed faintly as his hammer fell, as though the metal were remembering what it would one day mean, as though the future were bleeding backward through time to mark its own beginning. The Cyclopes worked around him in reverent silence, their great eyes reflecting entire centuries with every spark that flew. Venus watched, entranced, barely breathing. The clang of the hammers became a rhythm beneath her own heartbeat. Each blow sounded less like metal striking metal, and more like the pulse of time itself, like she was hearing the heartbeat of history being born. Hours passed, or perhaps days. Time moved strangely in the forge, bent by heat and purpose. Finally, when the last echo faded, and the last spark fell, the shield lay before them smooth, perfect, impossibly alive with light. Within its curved surface, images moved in the firelight, seeming to breathe, to live independent lives. Vulcan touched its edge with fingers surprisingly gentle for hands that could bend steel. "It is done," he said quietly. "No blade forged by mortal hands will pierce it. Magic itself will slide off its surface like water from oiled bronze. But more importantly, it will remind him who he is, what he carries, what waits beyond his suffering." Venus stepped closer, her reflection shimmering in the polished metal, alongside the countless futures Vulcan had embedded there. She saw not herself but her son, his weary face, his steady eyes, his shoulders bent under invisible weight. "He will not understand all that it shows," she said softly. "The images will be mysteries to him." "No one ever does," Vulcan replied with the wisdom of someone who'd been creating for eternity. "The future belongs to confusion as much as to glory. We see patterns. Mortals see only chaos until they're standing in the middle of what we showed them. Then they say, 'Oh, that's what it meant,' but by then it's too late to change course." She laughed quietly despite everything, a sound like bells in distant valleys. "You speak like a philosopher now. The forge has made you wise. I spend my days listening to hammers," he said with a shrug that sent ripples through his massive shoulders. "It's impossible not to think about cause and effect when your entire existence is about transforming one thing into another." She smiled and placed her hand lightly on his arm, a rare gesture of genuine affection. "Thank you, my husband, for this, for understanding, for caring about a mortal you've never met." He hesitated, then returned the gesture, a moment of tenderness between gods long separated by pride and different paths, by the complications of divine marriage and the wandering nature of desire. "Bring him victory," Vulcan said, his voice thick with unexpected emotion. "Or at least bring him home to whatever home he builds. Let my work mean something beyond beauty." Venus nodded solemnly. "If the fates allow it, I will." "But the fates," Vulcan muttered, turning back to his cooling anvil. "Are terrible listeners. They hear only what serves their purposes." Venus lifted the shield, and though it was large enough to protect a full-grown warrior, it felt weightless in her divine hands. Yet she could feel the immense gravity of what it held, the promise of cities not yet built, of centuries waiting in silence for a single act to begin them, of millions of lives depending on one man's choices in the coming days. She gathered the rest of the armor, the sword that could cut through destiny itself, the greaves that would carry him forward even when his own will faltered, the helmet that would mark him as chosen. All of it gleamed with craftsmanship that exceeded anything mortal smiths had achieved or could achieve in 1,000 generations. She carried it all upward, out of the forge, through the smoke and into the open air. The night sky above the mountain was still dark, but the eastern horizon had begun to pale with the promise of dawn. The goddess paused for a moment to watch it. This daily miracle of returning light. The first streak of dawn touched the shield's surface, and for an instant the entire sky seemed reflected there. Clouds, stars, and something else, something larger and more terrifying, as if the universe itself were acknowledging the gift, recognizing that something of consequence had been created. Then she turned and flew westward, her path a quiet blaze across the heavens that only other immortals could see, carrying hope forged in divine fire toward a mortal who had no idea his life was about to change again. Down below, by the Tiber's edge, Aeneas stirred in his sleep. His dreams shifted without clear cause. The river that had been grey and ordinary now shimmered with impossible gold, and a faint hum of hammers echoed somewhere deep within the sound of flowing water. He woke suddenly, completely, with the scent of roses carried strangely through the morning air, though no roses grew nearby. Before him stood Venus, luminous but gentle, her presence warm rather than blinding as divine visitations often were. The other men still slept. Only the crackle of the dying fire witnessed her arrival. She had made herself visible only to him, a private moment between mother and son. "My son," she said, her voice low as a lullaby but carrying the weight of prophecy. "You will have what courage alone cannot give, what strength alone cannot win." She held out the armor, the breastplate gleaming like captured dawn, the helmet radiant with purpose, the shield glowing with a light that pulsed softly, rhythmically like a heartbeat, or perhaps like the beating of time's own drum. Aeneas rose slowly, reverently, unable to speak. His throat had closed with emotion. "Mother," he finally whispered, "are these for protection?" Venus smiled with infinite sadness and infinite love, for remembrance. Every battle needs more than strength, more than skill. It needs a reason that survives the fear, that outlasts the pain. Look at the shield. He reached for it with trembling hands, and as his fingers brushed the metal, warm despite the cool morning, images stirred across its surface. Wolves nursing human children, kings crowning themselves and being overthrown, banners spreading across continents, ships sailing to the edges of the world and beyond. He saw flashes of something vast, unknowable, magnificent and terrible in equal measure. The light from these visions washed over him, filling his chest with a strange calm that felt like acceptance of enormous responsibility. "These images," he said, his voice breaking, "what are they?" "Your legacy," Venus said simply. "The future you will father, the city that will outlast empires, the name that will be spoken when all others have been forgotten." When he looked up again to thank her, to ask 1,000 questions, Venus was already fading, dissolving like mist before the sun. Only the faint scent of roses lingered, and the impossible weight of divine armor in his arms. Aeneas sat beside the fire, the shield resting against his knees. He traced its edge with his thumb, feeling the grooves that Vulcan's hammer had left, reading in them like a blind man reads raised letters. He could not fully decipher the visions it held, could not understand all the images that swam across its surface, but he sensed that somewhere within its glow lay the shape of everything to come, the cost, the triumph, the long echo of his own name whispered through time like a prayer or a curse. He smiled faintly despite the tears on his cheeks. "Thank you," he murmured to the air, to the absent goddess, to whatever fate was listening, for making destiny visible, if only for a moment, for showing me that this suffering means something beyond itself. The river answered with its slow, steady song, eternal and patient, the same song it had been singing since the world was young, and would sing long after Rome itself had fallen to dust. And as dawn broke fully, spilling gold across the valley, the light of the new day reflected from the shield, sending a single beam of pure radiance across the sleeping camp and into the mist beyond. It stretched toward the distant hills where Rome would one day stand, as if pointing the way, as if the shield itself knew where it needed to go. The men began to stir, unaware that their leader now carried a piece of eternity beside him. They saw only the morning sun glinting off bronze, and thought it beautiful in a simple, uncomplicated way. They did not yet know they were looking at the future itself, newly forged in divine fire, and quietly waiting for history to catch up to prophecy. One by one they woke, and one by one they saw Aeneas sitting beside the fire, wearing armor that seemed to glow from within. Aeneas approached first, his eyes wide, and simply said, The gods have spoken. Yes, Aeneas replied, still staring at the shield. The question is whether I can understand what they're saying. Soft reflective outro. So ended the night of the divine forge, the night when gods laboured not for heaven but for the fragile hearts of men. While mortals slept beside their river, dreaming small dreams of home and safety, the future was hammered into form, glowing softly against the dawn. And when Aeneas lifted the shield, he did not lift a weapon but the mirror of all that his people would someday become, the glory and the horror, the triumph and the tragedy, the eternal weight of being remembered. The Tiber flowed on, carrying its secrets downstream. The hills waited, patient as stone. And Aeneas, son of Venus, father of nations to be, stood in the morning light wearing the weight of history and trying to remember how to breathe. The morning mist hung low over the camp when Aeneas emerged from his tent, carrying the armour the goddess had given him. The world seemed quieter, as if it too were holding its breath, as if all of creation paused to witness this moment. Dew clung to every leaf like tiny prisms, catching the first light. The air smelled faintly of iron and wet earth, of possibility and the particular stillness that comes before great change. He set the armour down upon a flat stone, smooth and dark, worn by centuries of river water. As the first rays of sun touched the metal, it came alive in ways that defied natural explanation. The bronze seemed to drink the light and transform it, glowing from within as though the forge fire had never fully left it. The men gathered slowly, drawn by instinct, or perhaps by the subtle shift in the morning's quality. They came rubbing sleep from their eyes, but sleep fell away the moment they saw what their leader had brought forth. They had seen armour before, had worn it, had cleaned it, had watched it fail to protect friends whose names they still whispered in quiet moments. But not like this, never like this. The breastplate shimmered as though it held the sunrise captive within its curves, as though dawn itself had been hammered into shape and offered as protection. The helmet's crest glowed faintly, crimson against the pale sky, the colour of courage or perhaps of the blood that courage always costs. And the shield, the shield! Its surface rippled with light like water disturbed by a stone, and within that light shapes began to stir, began to tell stories that hadn't yet happened. Aeneas lifted it carefully, reverently, feeling its weight, not heavy in the physical sense, but dense with meaning, with responsibility, with the accumulated gravity of everything it represented. Images moved across its surface like reflections upon water, like dreams half-remembered, like prophecies whispering themselves into being. He saw a city rising from dust, its walls gleaming white in perpetual sun. He saw banners unfurling from towers that scraped the clouds, standards bearing an eagle whose wings seemed to move in the shifting light. He saw people he did not know, men in white togas debating in marble forums, women at altars offering sacrifices to gods he recognized, and others he didn't, armies crossing oceans in ships that carried the future in their holds. He saw the wolf again, clearer now than in his dreams, nursing 2 infants beneath a sacred fig tree, her expression mixing ferocity with an almost human tenderness. He saw temples climbing toward heaven, their columns so numerous they looked like forests of stone. He saw roads stretching to impossible distances, connecting lands he'd never heard of, binding the world together with paths of fitted stone. He could not name all these things, could not put words to the visions that swam across the shield's face, but his heart recognized their meaning the way a sailor recognizes home waters, not by conscious knowledge but by something deeper, something written in the soul itself. Achates, standing near, his weathered face lit by the shield's strange glow, whispered with the awe of a man witnessing the divine made tangible, "What do you see?" Aeneas smiled faintly, though his eyes remained fixed on the shifting images. "Everything," he said softly, "and nothing I can yet understand. I see victories and defeats, triumphs and tragedies, all mixed together until I cannot tell which is which. I see the bones of time itself." He ran a hand along the shield's edge, feeling the perfect smoothness of divine craftsmanship, the slight warmth that pulsed beneath his palm like a heartbeat. "But I know this. Whatever these visions are, whatever futures they promise or threaten, they are what we're meant to become. This is the map of our descendants' journey, written in bronze and prophecy." The men murmured among themselves, their voices low and reverent. Some reached out tentatively to touch the armour, pulling back their hands quickly as though afraid the divinity might burn. Others simply stared, their expressions shifting between wonder and fear, between pride and the terrible weight of understanding that they were no longer just refugees but the founders of something vast. For the first time since leaving Troy, since watching their city burn and their world end, they felt not only hope but pride. Their suffering had not been mere wandering, not pointless meandering across hostile seas. It had been building toward this, toward a purpose so large they could barely glimpse its outline. Even the river seemed to hum with approval, its morning song taking on a deeper resonance. Evander arrived soon after, his arrival announced by the tap of his staff against stone. When he saw the shield, when the morning light caught its surface and threw reflected patterns across his aged face, he stopped. For a long moment he simply stared, and then slowly, with the careful deliberation of someone performing a sacred ritual, he bowed his head. "The gods have armed you well, Trojan," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "May they also arm your judgment with equal care. Divine gifts have a way of demanding divine wisdom. They have armed me too well for peace," Aeneas said softly, and there was sorrow in his voice. The sorrow of a man who understands that some gifts are also burdens. This armor calls for use. It demands action. It whispers of battles I would rather avoid. Evander's eyes darkened with understanding. He had lived long enough to recognize the tragedy of necessary violence. "Peace seldom survives prophecy," he said. "The moment you name a destiny, you begin the journey toward it, wanted or not. The shield shows you glory, but glory is just another word for the price paid by the dead." They spoke long into the morning, sitting on stones by the water's edge, their conversation ranging across strategy and philosophy, hope and pragmatism. Evander promised men brave Arcadians, farmers turned fighters, who knew every curve of the hills, every hidden path, every place where an army might stumble or find advantage. He offered his horses, his food stores carefully hoarded against lean winters, and his counsel earned through decades of careful survival. And with all this generosity, spoken with the careful tone of a man who knows what he's asking, came one request, that Aeneas take his son Pallas into battle. "My boy has courage," Evander said, and the words seemed to cost him something vital, more courage than wisdom, as the young always do. But he lacks the scars that make courage wise. He sees war as a stage for heroism, rather than a graveyard for the unprepared. He paused, his hand tightening on his staff. "Let him fight beside you. Let him learn what it means to be part of history, before history decides his role for him." Aeneas looked across the camp to where Pallas stood, bright-eyed and eager, polishing armor that had never seen battle, talking animatedly with other young men about glory and honor, and all the beautiful lies that war tells to attract its victims. He thought of Aeneas, his own son, still too young for this, but growing toward it with terrible inevitability. He thought of all the fathers who had sent sons to war, all the sons who had never returned to make their father's hair turn grey with waiting. He hesitated, feeling the weight of this promise, understanding that he was accepting responsibility for something more precious than any shield. "He will be as my brother," he said at last, the words a vow spoken before gods and men, "or as my son. I will guard him as I guard my own life." Evander clasped his forearm, the grip tight enough to leave marks. "Then I entrust him to you, and to the gods who still have patience with mortals. Bring him back to me, or bring him back as something I can bury with honor." Later, as the camp prepared for departure, men checking straps and sharpening blades, saying prayers to household gods carried from distant homes, Aeneas stood alone by the river. The shield lay beside him, its surface reflecting the sky, the clouds, the wheeling flight of birds, and beneath these mundane reflections, the deeper images that never quite stilled. He thought of what it meant to bear such a gift. It was not merely protection against spears and arrows, not simply divine craftsmanship meant to turn aside mortal blows. It was prophecy made metal, destiny given weight and form. Every blow struck upon it would echo through centuries. Every time he raised it in battle, he would be defending not just his own life but the lives of millions yet unborn. He whispered to the morning, to the river, to whatever gods might be listening, "If I am the seed of something eternal, then may the tree that grows remember its roots. May it remember that empires begin in humility, in promises made to old kings beside quiet rivers. May it remember kindness before conquest." The river murmured in reply, its voice the same patient whisper it had offered since their first meeting. A breeze lifted the leaves of nearby willows, making them rustle like applause, or perhaps like the whispered prayers of future generations thanking him for choices not yet made. It sounded almost like assent, almost like blessing. Above, a hawk circled, riding thermals invisible to earthbound eyes, and Aeneas watched it spiral higher and higher until it was just a speck against the infinite blue. He wondered if the gods saw mortals the same way. Tiny figures moving across vast landscapes, their individual struggles barely visible from such heights, yet somehow still mattering, still weaving the great tapestry of time. He picked up the shield, feeling its weight settle against his arm as though it had always belonged there. The metal was warm despite the morning cool, alive with the purpose that Vulcan had hammered into every curve and line. "Come then," he said to the armor, "to the day, to his destiny. Let us begin." By the third morning, the Trojans and their new allies were ready for departure. The valley echoed with the sounds of preparation, hooves striking packed soil in steady rhythm, blades being tested against the air with whispers of steel, the deep rhythmic chant of men gathering courage through motion and shared breath. It was the music of war preparing to wake, each note a promise of violence to come. Pallas rode at the front beside Aeneas, wearing armor newly polished but still too clean, still unmarked by the scratches and dents that tell the story of a warrior's survival. His face glowed with the particular excitement of youth that has not yet learned to fear what it seeks. "Is war always this noisy?" he asked, trying to sound casual but unable to hide the tremor of anticipation in his voice. Aeneas smiled faintly, remembering his own first march toward battle, how the noise had seemed like thunder announcing the arrival of heroes. "The noise is courage pretending it isn't afraid," he said. "The louder men are before battle, the more they're trying to drown out the voice inside that tells them to run. True courage is usually quieter." The young man nodded solemnly as though receiving sacred wisdom, though a spark of excitement still glimmered in his eyes, the kind of excitement that would either be transformed into hardened resolve or extinguished entirely by what was coming. Aeneas had seen both outcomes too many times to predict which path any particular youth would take. They crossed the Tiber under morning light that turned the water to liquid gold. The current caught the oars and carried them forward with surprising gentleness, the river itself seeming to approve of their mission, to bless their passage with favourable waters. Birds rose from the reeds as they passed, their wings catching light, scattering into the sky like prayers ascending. Fishermen watched from the banks, their nets forgotten in their hands, sensing with the instinct common people have for history that this moment would outlive them, that their grandchildren's grandchildren would tell stories about the day the Trojan crossed the river with divine armour and an army at his back. When they reached the opposite bank, they found allies waiting as promised, Etruscan warriors, strong and disciplined, their bodies marked with the scars of previous campaigns, their armour bearing strange symbols of gods whose names the Trojans didn't know, gods of mountains and underground rivers, of volcanic fires and ancient treaties with the earth itself. Their leader, Tarchon, stepped forward, a man whose face had been weathered by 50 winters into something resembling carved wood, beautiful in its hardness. He greeted Aeneas with a clasp of forearms, the warrior's greeting that measures a man's strength in the first moment of contact. "We've heard of you," he said, his voice like gravel grinding against stone. "The man who carries his city on his shoulders, the son of Venus who weeps for the dead, the warrior who fights not from hatred but from necessity." Aeneas inclined his head, accepting the description without pride or false modesty. "Then you've heard of our burdens as well. You know what we carry and what we've lost." Tarchon laughed, the sound surprisingly warm coming from such a hard face. "Good. It means we understand each other. I have no patience for heroes who think war is glorious. War is butcher's work, sometimes necessary butcher's work, but butchery nonetheless." That night, they camped on a ridge overlooking the plain where Turnus's forces had gathered like a storm waiting to break. Fires dotted the darkness below like scattered constellations, each one a promise of violence waiting to ignite, each one surrounded by men who were also sons and fathers and brothers, who also carried memories of homes left behind and futures hoped for. Aeneas sat beside Pallas on the ridge's edge, both of them staring down at that field of lights. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of distant cooking fires, and the particular smell that armies have leather and metal, sweat and horse, fear masked by bravado. "Beyond those hills," Aeneas said softly, pointing toward the dark shapes that framed the plain, "lies the rest of your life. When you cross them tomorrow, you stop being who you were. Every battle changes a man, even the ones he wins, especially the ones he wins." Pallas frowned slightly, his young face creasing with the effort of understanding. "Do you regret your battles, the ones you survived?" Aeneas thought for a long moment, watching the distant fires flicker like uncertain stars. "I regret their necessity," he said finally. "I regret that the world is arranged in such a way that good men must kill other good men to protect what they love. I regret every face I remember in the darkness, every name I carry like a stone. But I don't regret fighting. The alternative would have been worse." The boy nodded, not fully understanding but pretending he did with the earnestness of youth, trying to seem older than its years. He would understand soon enough. Battle taught lessons that no amount of talking could convey. Around them, the camp settled into the uneasy half-sleep of men on the eve of battle. Some sharpened blades that were already sharp, finding comfort in familiar motions. Others prayed quietly to gods they hoped were listening. A few sang old songs in low voices, sharing the comfort of remembered melodies from happier times. At dawn, the horns blew long mournful notes that seemed to rise from the earth itself, calling men to their destinies. The two armies formed lines across the fields, thousands of men arranging themselves into the patterns of war, becoming not individuals but units, instruments in a deadly song. The air trembled with tension, that peculiar quality of stillness before violence erupts, when every nerve is stretched taut, and time seems to slow down, making each heartbeat distinct and precious. The silence before the first clash is always the loudest sound in the world, deafening in its weight. Turnus rode at the head of his host, bright and terrible on a white horse that pranced with nervous energy. His armor caught the sun and threw it back amplified, making him seem larger than life, a figure from legend rather than flesh and blood. His confidence radiated like heat from a forge, the absolute certainty of a man who had never truly lost anything. He called across the distance, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Trojans, you've wandered long enough. This land has owners. These hills have names, and none of them are yours. Leave your omens and your excuses, and go home if you can remember where home was before you burned it." The insult was calculated to wound, to provoke rashness. Some of the Trojan veterans tensed, hands tightening on weapon hilts. But Aeneas simply raised his hand, and the gesture commanded silence, commanded patience. "This is home," he said. And though he didn't shout, his words somehow carried across the field with perfect clarity. "The gods led us here. The river welcomed us. The earth beneath our feet has already drunk our sweat and will drink our blood if it must. We are done wandering." There was no more need for words. Words had done their work, had drawn the lines that could not be uncrossed. The horns cried out again, shrill and urgent, and the plain erupted into chaos as two futures collided, each trying to kill the other into existence. The sound was overwhelming, the clash of metal on metal, the screams of wounded horses, the shouted orders lost in the general roar, the particular sound a spear makes when it finds flesh, the grunt of men pushing against shields in the eternal test of strength against strength. And Aeneas moved through it like a storm through wheat, measured, unstoppable, but not cruel. He fought with the efficiency of someone who had done this too many times, who knew that hesitation killed, and that mercy had its place, but not in the moment of contact. Yet even in the fury of battle, he fought not to kill but to end killing faster. Each swing of his sword meant to break enemy formation rather than rack up individual deaths. The divine armor sang as it turned aside blows that should have killed him. The shield blazed when weapons struck it, throwing back not just force but light, as though even in battle it was showing visions of the future it was protecting. Beside him, Pallas fought with the quick grace of youth, his movements clean and economical, lacking the refinements that only experience brings but compensating with speed and enthusiasm. For a while, fortune seemed to favor him. Enemy warriors fell back before his charge, surprised by his ferocity, by the joy that seemed to illuminate his face even in the midst of carnage. Around them, the battle raged like a living thing, feeding on blood and fear, growing larger with each passing moment until it seemed to fill the entire world, until nothing existed except the immediate need to survive the next heartbeat, the next blade seeking gaps in armor. The morning wore on, and the sun climbed higher, bearing witness to humanity's oldest ritual, the dance of death that had been performed since the first man raised a stone against his brother. The field grew slippery with blood, the air grew thick with dust and smoke, and still the battle continued, neither side breaking, neither side willing to be the first to admit that all this suffering might be for nothing. Battle is never as grand as poets claim in their comfortable studies, never as orderly as historians describe in their careful chronicles. From above, from the perspective of gods lounging on clouds, it might look like order, lines advancing and retreating, banners moving in comprehensible patterns, brilliant motion that follows some kind of logic. But up close, where mortals actually experience it, it's mud and sweat and breath that burns in your lungs. It's confusion that kills as surely as swords. It's fear given form and set loose to feed. The air shakes with the sound of iron meeting flesh, of men crying names that no one will ever write down, calling for mothers or gods or simply screaming formless sound to release the terror that cannot be contained. The living trip over the dead. The wounded crawl toward anything that looks like safety. And through it all, the machinery of war continues its work with mechanical indifference. Aeneas moved through this chaos like a storm through wheat. Measured, unstoppable, but not wasteful in his violence. Each blow was calculated, each movement efficient. He had learned long ago that rage makes you careless and carelessness makes you dead. He fought with the cold precision of someone who understood that the fastest way to end killing was to break the enemy's will to continue. Pallas fought near him, his movements growing more confident with each exchange. His earlier nervousness burned away by the heat of combat. His armor gleamed with sweat and blood, some his own from minor cuts, most from others. For a while, fortune seemed to favor him with the particular affection she sometimes shows the young and brave. Enemy warriors fell before him, and each small victory fed his confidence, until he began to believe what every young warrior believes at some point, that he might be special, that he might be the one who survives unscathed, that glory might actually be worth its price. Then the tide turned with the suddenness that characterizes battle, that reminds us that fortune is fickle, and fate has no loyalty to courage. Turnus himself saw the boy, recognized his courage from across the field, and something in that recognition, perhaps admiration, perhaps the predator's instinct to eliminate the strong before they become stronger, made him spur his white horse forward. The crowd of fighting men seemed to part before him, or perhaps they simply chose other opponents, sensing that what was about to happen needed space, needed witnesses, needed to be remembered. Turnus rode through the opening like destiny itself, inevitable and terrible, his armor blazing in the midday sun. They met in a cleared space that had been created by chance or fate, the noise of the larger battle fading for an instant, as though the world itself were holding its breath, as though even war wanted to stop and watch what was about to unfold. Pallas saw him coming, and instead of retreating, instead of calling for help, he stepped forward. His voice carried clearly despite the surrounding chaos. "If you have honor, face me, not my men. Let this be between us." Turnus reined in his horse and dismounted with fluid grace. He smiled, not mockingly, but almost kindly, with the particular gentleness that warriors sometimes show each other before trying to kill one another. "You have your father's bravery," he said, and there was genuine respect in his voice. "May the gods record it. May they remember your name when mine is forgotten." Their weapons met with a clash that rang like a bell announcing someone's ending. Sparks flew from the contact, bright as falling stars. They circled each other, testing, probing for weakness, each looking for the opening that would end this dance. Pallas fought well, better than anyone so young had a right to. His training showed in every movement, every parry and thrust. He had been taught by masters, had practiced since childhood, had dreamed of this moment even as he feared it. For a few exchanges he even seemed to have the advantage, his youth giving him speed that Turnus's experience couldn't quite match. But Turnus was stronger, seasoned by years of war and the particular education that comes from surviving when others don't. He was fighting with the patient cruelty of someone who knows that time is on his side, that youth burns bright but burns fast. He let Pallas tire himself against his defense, let the boy's enthusiasm become exhaustion, waited for the inevitable mistake that comes when strength begins to fail. When it came, a guard dropped half an inch too low, a step that landed wrong. Turnus moved with the speed of a striking snake. His spear drove forward, finding the gap between breastplate and shoulder guard, the vulnerable space that all armor has because the human body requires movement. The sound it made was small, almost delicate, like glass cracking in cold water. Not the grand dramatic sound that death should make, but something quiet and almost apologetic. Pallas's eyes went wide, not with pain yet, that would come later, but with surprise. The surprise of someone who had believed himself protected, who had trusted in youth's illusion of immortality, who was suddenly confronted with the reality that bodies are fragile things easily broken. He fell slowly, as if the air had thickened, as if time itself had slowed to grant him a few more moments of existence. His sword slipped from fingers that no longer responded to his will. His knees buckled, and then he was on the ground, the earth rising to meet him with maternal gentleness. He looked up at the sky, and his expression changed. The surprise faded, replaced by something else, recognition perhaps, or maybe just the particular peace that sometimes comes at the end, as if he were seeing something beyond the blue expanse, beyond the clouds and wheeling birds, something that we who still live cannot perceive. The noise of battle faded around him. For him, the war was over. The shouting became distant, unimportant. His breath came in short gasps, each one requiring more effort than the last. He thought of his father standing on the hill at home, watching the sunrise. He thought of the girl in the village who had smiled at him before he left. He thought of all the things he would never see, never do, never become. Then even thinking became too difficult, and there was only the sky, growing brighter. Or perhaps it was his vision dimming, the world washing out to white like an overexposed painting, and then nothing at all. Turnus stood over him, breathing hard from exertion, and something else, perhaps regret, perhaps recognition of what he'd just destroyed. He looked down at the body of this boy who had died bravely, who had faced him without running, who deserved to be remembered in songs, but would likely become just another name on a long list of the fallen. He saw the belt Pallas wore, embroidered with scenes in thread of gold, depicting heroes and monsters, a gift from Evander, something precious given with a father's love to protect a son who couldn't be protected, for reasons even he didn't fully understand. Turnus reached down and took it. Maybe as a trophy, maybe as proof he'd lived long enough to make mistakes, maybe because something in him needed to carry this weight, needed to remember this moment and what it cost. He held the belt for a moment, feeling its weight, feeling the craftsmanship, feeling the love that had gone into its making. Then he fastened it around his own waist and returned to the battle, where more killing waited, where more mistakes could be made, where glory continued to feast on the young and stupid and brave. When Aeneas found the body, the day was ending. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting everything in shades of red and gold, colours too beautiful for what they illuminated. He pushed through the scattered corpses and the wounded crawling toward safety, following some instinct or perhaps just the terrible knowledge that something precious had been lost. He knelt beside the boy, his divine armour scraping against the ground, making a sound like grief given voice. He placed a hand on Pallas's shoulder, feeling the warmth already beginning to fade, feeling the absolute stillness that death brings. The armour still shone faintly, as if refusing to believe its wearer was gone, as if divine craft could somehow deny mortal reality. He did not weep. The grief was too large for tears, too vast to be contained in something as small as salt water and trembling shoulders. It sat in his chest like a stone, immovable, permanent, a weight he would carry for the rest of his life. Some griefs are too deep for expression, too fundamental to be processed by something as simple as crying. He whispered, his voice barely audible over the dying sounds of battle. "You were meant to see the city we'll build. You were meant to walk streets that don't exist yet, to live in the peace we're trying to purchase with blood. Now you will see it from the stars, if the stars care about such things, if the dead can look down and find comfort in the suffering of the living." Then he did what had to be done. He covered Pallas's face with his cloak, the same gesture Anchises had once made for him when Troy burned, when the world ended the first time. The same gesture warriors had been making since the first battle, the simple acknowledgement that death has dignity, that the dead deserve privacy in their silence. History, it seemed, loved to repeat its wounds. The same gestures, the same griefs, the same tears shed for different faces wearing the same expression of final surprise. War didn't invent anything new, it just repeated the same lessons until either we learnt them or there was no one left to teach. He stayed there a long time, kneeling beside the body, unable to move, unable to process what he knew he would have to tell Evander. How do you tell a father that his son died bravely, that he died for a cause that mattered, that his death meant something? How do you make those hollow words sound like comfort when you know they're not, when you know that nothing compensates for absence, for silence, for the future that will never arrive? Finally, he stood. Other hands would carry Pallas back to camp, would wash the body and prepare it for burning, would perform all the rituals that humans have developed to pretend that death is orderly, that it can be managed with ceremony and proper procedure. But nothing would bring back the brightness in those eyes, the enthusiasm that had annoyed and charmed him in equal measure. He looked up at the darkening sky, at the first stars beginning to appear, cold and distant and uncaring. Was this necessary? He asked them, asked the gods, asked fate itself. Was this part of the design, or just chaos wearing the mask of destiny? The stars offered no answer. They never did. After Pallas's death, something shifted in Aeneas. The change was subtle but fundamental, like a river altering its course by inches until suddenly it's flowing in an entirely different direction. He moved through the remaining hours of battle like a man walking through a dream that had turned to stone, like someone watching himself from outside his own body. Every command he gave came out level, controlled, empty of emotion. Every sword he lifted felt lighter than it should, as if his arm had stopped registering physical weight and responded only to the weight of purpose. He was touched by quiet fury, not the hot rage that makes men careless, but the cold kind that makes them efficient, that strips away hesitation and replaces it with mechanical precision. The war dragged on through the night, both armies too committed to stop, too deep in blood to find the path back to negotiation. Men fought in darkness illuminated only by torches and burning siege equipment, fighting more by sound than sight, swinging at shadows that sometimes turned out to be friends. By dawn, the field was a landscape of mist and sorrow, the morning fog mixing with smoke to create a grey veil that softened the hard edges of carnage without making it any less terrible. The Trojans pushed forward, driven not by ambition but by a promise, now unpaid, by the debt owed to a boy who had trusted them to keep him alive. Every step forward was both revenge and apology, both triumph and lament. Turnus, still confident despite mounting losses, sought Aeneas among the chaos. He wanted a clean ending, a duel to finish what politics and prophecy had started, single combat to spare his remaining men the slow grinding death of continued battle. Aeneas found him first, emerging from the smoke and confusion like something summoned by grief itself. They met beside the river, the same river that had welcomed Aeneas's arrival weeks ago with gentle current and whispered promises. The water ran red now, but steady, indifferent as always to what mortals did to each other on its banks. Rivers witness everything and remember nothing, or perhaps they remember everything but judge nothing, simply continuing their journey to the sea. Turnus raised his sword in salute, a gesture of respect that felt both appropriate and absurd given what they were about to do. "You came for vengeance," he said, and there was no mockery in his voice, only acknowledgement. "Here I am. Let's finish this so the rest can go home." Aeneas said nothing. Words had lost their importance. Everything that needed to be said had been said by the dead, their silence more eloquent than any speech. He simply raised his shield, the divine shield that had protected him through impossible odds, and advanced. They circled each other, two men carved by destiny into shapes neither would have chosen, both weary of being symbols, both just wanting this to be over. The watching soldiers fell silent, creating a ring of witnesses. Even the wounded stopped their crying to watch, understanding that what happened in the next few moments would determine everything. The clash was swift and brutal, none of the graceful dance that poets describe. This was killing work, practiced by men who knew their craft too well. Steel rang against the divine shield, sending sparks and visions scattering. Turnus was strong, skilled, desperate, but Aeneas fought with something beyond skill, beyond desperation. He fought with the accumulated grief of everyone he'd failed to save, everyone he'd watched die while he survived. The sand beneath their feet grew torn and scattered. Their breath came in harsh gasps. Sweat stung their eyes. Time lost meaning. The fight might have lasted minutes or hours. There was no way to tell. Only the endless exchange of blows, the constant testing for weakness, the gradual erosion of strength until someone made the final mistake. Turnus fell at last, his ankle turning on loose stone, his balance lost for just a moment. But a moment was enough. Aeneas's blade found its mark, not killing but wounding grievously, ending the contest. Turnus collapsed, his sword falling from his grip, his blood dark against the pale sand. Aeneas stood over him, his blade poised for the final stroke. His chest heaved with exertion. His armour, divine though it was, bore the marks of the day's violence, scored with scratches that would have been death wounds on lesser protection. "You've taken too much," Aeneas said, his voice rough. "Too many lives, too many futures. How many fathers will not see their sons return because of you?" Turnus, gasping, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth, gestured weakly toward the sky with one trembling hand. "If mercy still lives in the world," he said, each word costing him something vital, "give it to me. I fought for what I believed was mine. I fought for honor. Let that count for something." For a heartbeat, a single suspended moment, the world balanced on the edge of a blade. War and peace held their breath. Rage and pity stood at equal weights. The watching soldiers leaned forward, waiting to see which version of their leader would emerge victorious. The man who had carried his father from burning Troy, or the man whose hands were red with the day's necessary killing. Aeneas looked down at the defeated warrior. He saw a man not much different from himself. Someone shaped by circumstances beyond his control. Someone trying to protect what he loved. Someone who had made the mistake of standing between prophecy and its fulfillment. He felt mercy stirring in his chest, that most human of impulses, the desire to spare even when sparing is difficult. Then his gaze fell upon the belt at Turnus's waist, Pallas's belt, the one embroidered with golden thread, given by a father to a son with all the hope and love that such gestures carry. The belt of a boy who had died trusting that Aeneas would protect him. The decision made itself. Perhaps it had already been made the moment Pallas fell. Perhaps it had been written on the divine shield along with all the other futures, all the other necessary cruelties that empire would require. Perhaps mercy had died along with the boy, burned away by the heat of grief until only justice remained, cold, final, absolute. The sword struck once. There was no drama in it, no grand gesture, just a movement practiced 10,000 times, muscle memory completing what the heart could not bear to consider. Turnus's eyes widened briefly, then went still. His hand fell from its supplicating gesture. His last breath whispered out across the sand, joining all the other last breaths that had been exhaled on that field, indistinguishable from them. Silence followed, thick, heavy, profound. The kind of silence that comes when something irreversible has occurred, when the world has shifted its weight and cannot shift back. Even the river seemed to pause, though of course it didn't, it never did. It simply continued its patient journey toward the sea, washing blood into memory, carrying away the evidence of what men do to each other when God set them in opposition. Above them, the hills glowed faintly in the morning light. Those 7 hills that Evander had pointed out, where Rome would rise, where all of this suffering would be transformed into something the poets would call glorious. The hills waited, patient as stone, ready to receive the foundations of eternity. Aeneas stood still, his sword lowering slowly, as though it had become too heavy to hold. He felt no triumph, no surge of victory, no joy in conquest, only the heavy calm of completion, the particular emptiness that follows when a long task finally ends. Fate had done what it came to do, the prophecy had found its conclusion. Though as always, endings are only disguised beginnings, one chapter closing so another can commence. He whispered, more to himself than to anyone listening, "It is finished." Around him, men began to move again. The spell of the moment breaking, soldiers lowered their weapons, the wounded called out for water and help. The living began the grim work of accounting for the dead, of sorting through the aftermath, of trying to make sense of what had just been purchased with so much blood. Somewhere beyond the horizon, beyond the reach of mortal sight, the gods turned their eyes away. They had watched the game play out, had made their wagers and formed their allegiances, had pushed their pieces across the board. Now it was over, and already they were growing bored, looking for the next drama, the next mortal who would be foolish or unfortunate enough to attract divine attention. The world exhaled, a long, slow breath that ruffled leaves and carried away smoke. The violence was over. Now came the harder work of living with what violence had created. That night, when the fires burned low and the dead lay quiet beneath their shrouds, when the wounded had been tended and the watches set, Aeneas walked alone to the river. The camp behind him hummed with exhausted voices, men too tired to sleep, too haunted by what they'd done and seen to find rest easily. But he needed solitude, needed to be alone with the weight of the day. He carried his shield with him, the divine gift that had protected him through impossible odds, that had turned aside blows that should have ended him. He set it beside him on the bank, and looked into its shining face, into the bronze surface that held more than reflections. The images still glowed faintly in the starlight. Battles yet to come, temples yet to be built, triumphs yet to be celebrated, emperors yet to be crowned. He saw the wolf and the twins, saw the city rising from the 7 hills, saw roads stretching to the edges of the known world and beyond. He saw everything he had killed for, everything Pallas had died for, everything that would grow from this blood-soaked soil. He touched the surface gently with fingertips that still trembled slightly from the day's violence. The metal was cool now, having given up the warmth it held in sunlight. He murmured to it, to the future it represented, to the countless generations who would inherit what he was building. Let them remember us kindly. Let them understand that we did what we thought necessary, that we carried the weight because someone had to. Let them build something better than we could imagine, something that justifies the price we paid. The shield reflected the stars above, thousands of points of light scattered across infinite darkness like seeds thrown by a careless god. And perhaps, just for a moment, one of them seemed brighter than the others, seemed to pulse with recognition, seemed to wink in answer to his prayer. Or perhaps it was just his tired eyes playing tricks, finding meaning in randomness, because meaning was necessary to continue, because without meaning all of this was just butchery dressed in bronze and called by prettier names. He sat there a long time listening to the river's eternal song, letting its patience seep into him. The water had been here before humans learned to kill each other over prophecies and promises. It would be here after Rome rose and fell, after all the empires turned to dust, after the last person who remembered his name had gone to join him in whatever awaited the dead. There was comfort in that continuity, in the reminder that individual struggles, however crucial they seemed, were just moments in a much larger story. The river didn't care about destiny or duty or the divine right of nations. It simply flowed, and in its flowing carried everything eventually to the sea, where all things were made equal again, where the blood of heroes and cowards mixed indistinguishably. Behind him, someone approached Arcadians, faithful as always, unwilling to let his friend bear this weight alone. He sat beside Aeneas without speaking, understanding that some silences are better left unbroken. Together they watched the water flow past, watched the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, watched the night slowly give way to dawn. Finally, Arcadians spoke, his voice soft. "It's done then. The war is over." "This war is over," Aeneas corrected. "There will be others. The shield shows me that much. Peace is just the interval between conflicts, the breath we take before diving back into violence." "Then why do it? Why build anything if it's just going to be torn down?" Aeneas smiled slightly, tired but genuine. "Because the interval matters. Because the people who live in that peace won't care that it's temporary. For them it will be their whole world. Because building is its own justification, regardless of how long the building stands." Dawn came slowly, as though reluctant to illuminate what the night had hidden. The eastern sky turned from black to grey, to the faint pink of new beginning. Birds began their morning songs, indifferent to human sorrow, simply celebrating another day of existence. The camp stirred, men waking to aching muscles and memories that would not fade quickly. Aeneas stood, picking up his shield one last time, feeling its weight settle into the familiar position against his arm. The divine armor had served its purpose, had protected him through the trials that prophecy demanded. Now came the harder task of living up to what he'd been protected for, of building the city he'd been shown, of creating something worthy of the sacrifice. He looked one more time at the images swimming across the shield's surface. The wolf and her adopted children, the 7 hills crowned with glory, the roads connecting worlds, the eagles spreading their wings over nations yet unborn, all of it waiting in possibility, depending on choices not yet made, on the courage to continue when continuing seemed pointless. "Come," he said to Aeneas, his voice stronger now, touched with renewed purpose. "We have a city to build. Let's make sure it's worth everything it cost." They walked back toward camp together, toward the living and their demands, toward the future and its infinite complications. Behind them, the river continued its patient journey, carrying away the night, washing the stones clean, preparing for another day of bearing witness to what humans do when gods give them visions and then step back to watch what happens next. Soft, reflective outro. So ended the war for Latium. The gods withdrew, their entertainment concluded, their prophecies fulfilled to whatever degree satisfied them. The dead were honored with fire and song, their ashes mixed with the soil that would nourish the city to come. The wounded healed or didn't, their scars becoming the stories they would tell in taverns years later, when the pain had faded enough to make memory bearable. And Aeneas stood at the edge of the river, neither victor nor victim, only the bridge between what had been and what would come. He was the seed that had survived transplanting, that had been watered with blood and tears, that would grow into something neither he nor the gods could fully predict. From that quiet shore, the story of Rome would rise. Its triumphs that would shake the world, its tragedies that would break hearts, its endless rhythm of glory and grief, of building and destroying and building again. From that moment of silence after violence, when the last sword had fallen and the last breath had been exhaled, the eternal city would begin its long journey into history. And if you listen closely, beneath the hum of centuries, beneath the accumulated noise of empires rising and falling, you can still hear the river whispering the same word it spoke to Aeneas, that first morning, the word that started everything. Here. Here is where wandering ends and building begins. Here is where prophecy becomes stone and mortar. Here is where the future waits, patient as water, ready to be shaped by hands brave enough, or foolish enough to try. Here. The word echoes still, carried on the current, whispered by the wind through the 7 hills, spoken by the stones of roads that connect worlds. The river remembers, even if we forget. The earth holds the promise, even when we break faith. And somewhere in the fabric of time, Aeneas still stands on that bank, his shield reflecting eternity, ready to take the first step toward building something that will outlast his name. Here. The fire burns low now, The story of Aeneas and Lavinia rests in quiet ashes, a moment of peace before the horizon darkens. Tonight we saw the promise of a new life in Italy, the meeting of hearts beneath the eyes of the gods, and the first faint shadows of the war that destiny still keeps waiting. I hope this story carried you gently through the evening. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What city? What country? It's always fascinating to see how far these old Roman tales travel. If you've enjoyed drifting through history with me, consider leaving a like, a comment, or a small word of support. It truly helps these stories reach others who might need a calm voice by the fire. This was episode 3, Aeneas and Lavinia, the peace before the storm. Sleep well beneath the crackle of the hearth, and may tomorrow find you rested wherever you are.